Here's where it's about to get real. Having now gone over the outline of Vespers in some detail, our next stop will be the service of Matins. However, before we jump into that subject, we're first going to take a detailed look at the canon. For many, the canon is the most daunting part of Matins, and Matins itself is one of the more complex services of the entire daily cycle. So it will help our discussion of Matins if we come at it with some familiarity with the canon already in place. The Greek word canon, kanon, means a rule. And as used here in Matins, it originally referred to an ancient monastic rule of reading certain Old Testament texts in addition to the Psalms every day at Matins. These passages were selected from the wider scriptures because they were very similar in spirit to the Psalms, which made up the bulk of the monastic office. They're called canticles or odes. The two words are interchangeable. And they are the following: the Song of Moses in Exodus, the Song of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, the prayer of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, the prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, the prayer of Isaiah the prophet, the prayer of Jonah the prophet, the prayer of the three holy children, the song of the three holy children, the song of the Theotokos, or the Magnificat, and the prayer of Zacharias, the father of the forerunner, the Benedictus. Note that these are actually 10 texts, not 9. The last two, the Magnificat and the Benedictus, both from Luke chapter 1, they together comprise what we call Ode 9, or Canticle 9. So this entire set of biblical odes was read each day at Matins in the monastic practice, and altogether they comprised what became known as the canon. With time, some developments happened. First, short refrains came to be used after each biblical verse. And if you look at an Orthodox Psalter or Horologion, which always includes the odes, you'll see that the appointed refrain is printed at the top of each ode. However, they are no longer used in practice. As time went on, hymnographers began to compose troparia to be inserted between the biblical verses instead of those old refrains, much like the way that stichera are inserted between the psalm verses, the stichi and Lord I call at Vespers. St. Andrew of Crete was one of the first to write a set of troparia for the canon. And later, St. John of Damascus and many others followed. A set of troparia meant to be used with the biblical odes is itself referred to as a canon. So, the word canon, though originally referring to the biblical odes or canticles themselves, canon came to refer primarily to the hymns meant to be used in conjunction with those odes. And this is why when we see a canon in a service book, like the Menaion or the Octoakos, or in a prayer book used at home, it's divided up into 9 odes. Well, technically it has only 8 odes, because Ode 2 is usually missing, but we'll come back to that a little later. In each set of troparia composed for each ode of the canon, the first troparion has a special name. It's called the irmos. Irmos, it's a Greek word that means link, like a link in a chain. In a sense that this particular troparion links together the biblical ode into which it's inserted and the subsequent troparia. It can do this because it has a certain connection to both the biblical ode and the troparia. Its connection to the ode is thematic. It is usually a short paraphrase or reflection on a theme from the biblical ode. And its connection to the subsequent troparia is musical and poetic. In the original Greek, the irmos sets the meter, that is, the number of syllables and their stress, and therefore the actual melody to which the subsequent troparia would be sung. So here is a rough outline of one ode in a canon. In this pattern, we see something that should be familiar to us already. It's very similar to what we saw with stichera at Lord I Call at Vespers. At a certain point, the uninterrupted string of biblical text stops, and we begin to insert hymns between each verse. At the end of this series of hymns, we add Glory to the Father and a hymn, followed as usual by Now and Ever and a Theotokia. A couple lessons ago, we discussed how the stichera at Lord I Call are drawn from usually 2 or sometimes even 3 different liturgical books. For example, the Octoikos, the Triodion, and the Menaion. And they combine the different themes appointed for a particular day into one long thread. Well, something similar happens with the troparia used at each ode of the canon, where troparia from the Octoikos, or the Pentecostarion, will be followed by troparia from the Menaion, or during Lent, troparia from the Menaion are followed by troparia from the Triodion. On normal days, outside of Lent, whatever number of troparia from whichever books is prescribed for Ode 1 of the canon, the same pattern will be repeated in all the other odes. Thus, there is a cyclic quality to the canon. It revisits the same themes in each ode, but each ode is also different, being based on a unique biblical text. An ode of the canon for a typical Sunday Matins, for example, would look like this. Now, before we go further, it's worth mentioning that the word canon can be used in a couple different ways. I've already alluded to this. We've been using it to refer to the entire section of Matins that comprises the 9 biblical odes and the troparia composed to accompany them. But a canon also can refer to one complete set of troparia meant for the odes found in one of the liturgical books. So in the above example, we could say that the canon from the Octoikos is followed by the canon from the Menaion. Thus there are, in a manner of speaking, 2 canons being sung at this Matin service. But this doesn't mean that we do the entire Octoikos canon, odes 1 through 9, and then go back and do the entire Menaion canon, odes 1 through 9. No, what it means is that every ode of the canon uses troparia from both the Octoikos and the Menaion. So each ode follows the same pattern. That's why I described the structure of the canon as cyclical. It cycles through the same pattern on each ode. In the previous example, you can notice that there are a lot more troparia from the Octoikos than there are from the Menaion. Well, there's a reason for this. The Octoikos, in fact, provides not just one canon, but, on Sundays, 3 canons, focusing on the following themes. First, the resurrection. Second, the cross and the resurrection, called for short cross resurrection. And third, the Mother of God. So on a typical Sunday Matins, at each ode, we read from the first, second, and third canons of the Octoikos, and then the canon from the Menaion. And we repeat that in every ode. So let's refine our outline like this. And this pattern, as I say, it repeats itself on every ode, But, of course, the odes themselves are different, as are the troparia. There are many different combinations of canons prescribed, depending on the rank of the feast in the Menaion, or whether the Triodian or Pentecostarian is being used, or whether it's a weekday, or a Saturday, or a Sunday. We're not going to go into detail about all those possibilities, as it's too much for this introduction, and it's easy enough to look up what's prescribed in a rubrics guide or a liturgical calendar. You may have noticed the word katavasia at the end of the outline. A katavasia is, in fact, another yrmos, but it's sung at the end of the ode instead of the beginning. It's an yrmos that's usually taken from a different canon altogether. The word for this closing yrmos of an ode, katavasia, this word means descent, and it refers to an old practice where the two choirs on either side of the church would descend to the middle of the church to sing the katavasia, as a kind of big finish for each ode. The katavasia appointed for the end of each ode are all taken from the same canon. For example, for most of the year, the katavasias used are the yrmi in tone 4, used from many canons of the Mother of God. The opening line of the first ode yrmos in this set is, "I will open my mouth, and it will be filled with the Spirit." And the entire set of these katavasias can be referred to with these opening words from the first ode, "I will open my mouth." As with all the detailed instructions for the canon on a given commemoration, a rubrics guide or liturgical calendar would indicate which katavasias are appointed for a particular season or feast of the year. And such a guide would also indicate whether a katavasia is to be sung at the end of every ode, like on Sunday or festal matins, or just after some odes, as a daily matins. Now, the outline that we've been looking at is one full ode of the canon. But in practice, apart from some very large monasteries or cathedrals, the canon is usually shortened or abbreviated. The most notable abbreviation is that usually the biblical odes themselves are in fact not used. It is indeed ironic that the entire structure of the canon, as well as the themes of the yrmi, are based on these scriptural texts, but that for the most part, those verses from Scripture are rarely read. In most places, the only time that the biblical odes are read is on weekdays during Lent. So on all Sundays and feast days, and indeed on all the days of Holy Week and Bright Week, including Pascha, the canon includes the yrmi and the troparia, but not the verses from Scripture. But as we noted in a previous lesson, our services don't seem to like having two similar things right up next to each other. In the canon, each troparion is supposed to be separated from the next troparion by a verse from the biblical ode. But if those odes are taken out, then it would seem that something else should replace them. Something else should serve as a buffer, you might say, to put space between the troparia. And that's exactly what happens. There are short refrains used that somehow relate to the theme of the particular canon whose troparia are being read. Some common refrains are, "Glory to thee, our God, glory to thee," used for canons to the Lord. Or, "Have mercy on me, O God, have mercy on me," as for the canon of repentance by St. Andrew of Crete and other penitential canons. "Most Holy Theotokos, save us," is the refrain used for canons to the Mother of God, or for Theotokia found within other canons. There are in fact many different refrains, including specific refrains for the many classes of saints found in the Menaion. A full list of these refrains is provided in the book The Order of Divine Services that we've mentioned several times already. When the biblical odes are not used, which is most of the time, then each ode, we still refer to each grouping of troparia as an ode, even if the actual biblical odes are missing. Each ode begins right off with the Irmos. All the biblical verses prior to the Irmos are simply omitted, but nothing takes their place. So let's adjust how our outline looks now to show how an ode would be read without biblical odes, but with refrains instead. And so you can see that the refrain used each time pertains to the troparion following the refrain. You'll also notice that there is no refrain between the final Theotokion and the katavasia at the end. We should also mention that in Russian practice, only the Irmos and katavasia at the beginning and end of each ode are sung to a melody. All the other troparia, and usually the refrains as well, are simply read, on a note, though, not in a spoken tone of voice. They're read by one or two readers. Sometimes, especially for more festal occasions, the choir might also sing the refrains in between the troparia. The refrains are also sung at the great canon of St. Andrew in Lent. The canon of Pascha, however, is sung throughout, all its troparia and refrains. The Paschal canon is used on Pascha itself, of course, and on all the days of Bright Week, as well as at Sunday Matins throughout Paschaltide. But even without the biblical ode, and even with most of the canon read, not sung, this is still quite a lengthy set of texts, especially when we remember that the outline above is cycled through usually 8 times at a normal Matins. 8, not 9, because, remember, Ode 2 is usually omitted. Matins, even without the canon, is quite a lengthy service, considerably longer than Vespers. And even though the troparia composed for canons are rather short, much shorter than the average stichera, for example, still, for most parishes, an entire canon as prescribed by the Tikhon would make Matins an unwieldy affair for most Saturday evenings or Sunday mornings or feast days. As a result, each ode of the canon is usually significantly abbreviated. There are different local practices about how to do this. For example, some places only use one of the canons appointed. For example, the canon from the Octoikos for the resurrection, like this. Others use a selection of troparia from the Octoikos and the Menean, something like this. The shortest possible form of the canon, which is commonly found when Matins is served in the morning, right before liturgy, particularly in Greek and Antiochian parish practice, is to sing nothing but the appointed katavasias for each ode, all in a row. Only the katavasias, no irmos, no troparia, no refrains. Now, in the service of Matins, ordinarily, the 8 odes of the canon are grouped together into 3 sets, like this. Odes 1 and 3 together, odes 4, 5, and 6 as a group, and then as the last section, odes 7, 8, and the Magnificat, and ode 9. Remember that the Magnificat, that is the song of the Theotokos, "My soul magnifies the Lord," is actually the first of the 2 biblical texts associated with the 9th ode, the Magnificat and the Benedictus, the Song of Zechariah. And unlike all the other biblical texts, the Magnificat is almost never omitted, but it's sung separately from the troparia of the 9th ode, and each of its verses are followed by the refrain, "More honorable than the cherubim." The Magnificat is only omitted on great feasts and on a few other occasions throughout the year. Each of these 3 groups of the canon is followed by a little litany, and then some other hymns that are not strictly part of the canon, but but that are associated with it because of where they come in the order of Matins. Thus, after the third ode, the Little Litany followed by the sessional hymns, and then after the sixth ode, the Little Litany followed by the Kontakion, and after the ninth ode, the Little Litany followed by the Ex Apostolarian. We'll talk about these more next time. Now, I know you've been dying to ask about Ode 2. Why is it omitted so often, and when does it get used? The short answer is that it gets used on Tuesday mornings in Lent. The full answer is a little more complicated. It is not used most of the time throughout the year because of its particularly dark and penitential character that makes it especially suitable for Lent. But why only on Tuesdays in Lent? Remember that the reason that we call the Triodion by that name, that's the book that we use during Lent, the Triodion, is because the canons it contains for weekday matins throughout Lent normally have only 3 odes, Triodion. But they are not the same 3 odes every day. Ode 8 and Ode 9 are used every day of the week, but the other odes are used on a weekly cycle, like this. We see Ode 1 on Monday morning, and then we see Ode 2 on Tuesday morning. On Saturday morning, we see Odes 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. And so that is a 4-ode canon. The word for that, incidentally, is tetraodion, 4 odes. And there's also such a thing as a diodion, a 2-ode canon. These come up rarely, but there is a diodion at Bridegroom Matins for Tuesday and Holy Week. On Tuesday and Holy Week, Ode 2 is not used, so that leaves only Odes 8 and 9. Ordinarily, at Lenten Matins, the Menaion is still used, and it contains an ordinary 8-ode canon, just like throughout the rest of the year. So what this means is that the Menaion is used at every ode, but the 2 canons from the Triodion are added to the Menaion canon only on the 3 specific odes appointed for that day. So, for example, on a Monday morning in Lent, the canon would look like this. Tuesday morning in Lent is a little different because Ode 2 is used with the 2 canons from the Triodion and that ode, but there is no Ode 2 in the Menaion. So it looks like this. And so on. I wanted to go into a little bit of detail about the canon during Lent, because this knowledge will come in handy when we look at Lenten services later on in this course. For now, we are in good shape to move on to our next subject, the order of daily matins, and we'll be able to situate the canon in its place in Matins, having already learned its structure and content in some detail.